Hello all, welcome to History Lessons. After completing the Society of Europe on the Eve of French Revolution in the previous video, we thereby come to the final destination of our topic, that is Europe on the Eve of French Revolution. In the third video, that is in this video, we are going to know about the politics of Europe on the eve of French Revolution. When we are talking about the politics of Europe, it is impossible to avoid the impact of Enlightenment on it. Absolutism still regained over most of the continent, although in a modified form, and philosophers heaped praise upon the enlightened despotism practiced by the monarchs, who they believed were affected by a kind of philosophic propaganda. What can be further witnessed is that all the European countries had mutual rivalries and alliance throughout the period. The moment we will go through the slides, we will understand how much deep the rivalry was and how important the alliance helped them to stay as power or nominal power sometimes. The first country that we are going to look at is Great Britain. In the 18th century, or in the very first half or in the second decade of the 18th century, we can see that the Hanoverians were ruling England. In accordance with the provisions of the Act of Settlement, which was passed in 1701, George I, the first Hanoverian ruler of Great Britain, ascended the throne of England in 1714 after the death of Queen Anne. Now, what is this Act of Settlement? This Act of Settlement was a parliamentarian act which somehow gave the authority to the Protestants that only a Protestant ruler can ascend the throne of Great Britain ever since 1701. It was a ploy actually to disengage the entire family of Charles I and to disallow them to ever take the throne. Now, this is an interesting thing, because Queen Anne, as I said, was a daughter of James II, during whose reign the Glorious Revolution took place. His first daughter and his son-in-law, that is William III of Orange and Mary, were the king and queen of England respectively after the Glorious Revolution in 1688. But Mary died quite early and William III died in 1702. And it is from 1702 onwards that Queen Anne was the sovereign ruler and ruled till 1714. Now, she became the queen simply because Mary and William could not have heirs who could succeed them. Therefore, Anne came and took the throne. Now, when Anne died, she also was left heirless. Therefore, a granddaughter of Charles I was nominated, or rather selected, that she actually can succeed Queen Anne, and her name was Sophia. She was an electress of Hanover. As we know that elector, there was a position called elector who can choose or elect Holy Roman Emperor. Now she was the wife of the elector and known as electress. Sophia was the electress of Hanover and she was asked to take the throne. Just before few days of her enthronement, she died. She was aged. She lived more than 8 years. Now what could happen after that? Her son, George, took the throne. Thus became George I of England. Now, George I ruled till 1727 and he was succeeded by his son George II, who ruled up to 1760. It was during the reign of George I and George II that the Whig oligarchy ruled in England. It was during that period that the cabinet system was put on a stable basis and the office of the Prime Minister came into existence, and that too under Walpole. He was officially means what? Means it was taken to be that Walpole was the first Prime Minister of Great Britain and he is still longest serving Prime Minister. I think he ruled for 22 years or something like that. 2 decades of rule was never touched in Great Britain. Now it is during this time that England had to fight Jenkins' Year War or War of Jenkins' Year. Now what is this Jenkins' Year War or War of Jenkins' Year? Actually, the War of Jenkins' Year, also known as Guerra del Asiento in Spain, was a conflict between Britain and Spain lasting from 1739 to 1748, mainly in New Granada and among the West Indies of the Caribbean Sea, with major operations largely ended by 1742. Its name actually was coined by British historian Thomas Carlyle in 1858 refers to Robert Jenkins, a captain of British merchant ship whose ear was cut off by sailors of Spanish Coast Guard when they boarded his ship to search for contraband. Now, 7 years later, in support of mongering of war, James was paraded before the British Parliament without his ear. This is how Jenkins' ear, or War of Jenkins' Ear, actually took place. Let us come back to the main things. Jenkins' Ear War was fought during this time. The War of Austrian Succession and even the 7 Years' War all occurred during the time of George II. Now, when George II died in 1760, ultimately, George III, his son, succeeded him. We don't know who George III is right now, but if I say that George III was the grandfather of Queen Victoria, it would seem to be quite familiar to us. That who was George III? George III was the grandfather of Queen Victoria. Then in 1760, George III came to the throne and he ruled up to 1820. Now, 59 years he ruled. And he was, at that time, the longest ruler of the dynasty, or of Great Britain combined. It was only Queen Victoria who broke her record, who ruled for more than 60 years, 63, 64 years. And it is the great-great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria who broke her record. This is Queen Elizabeth II, who is still ruling for 70 years uninterrupted. Again, let us come back to the points. Now, from the very beginning, George III was determined to set up his personal rule. From 1760 to 1770, George III followed the policy of creating dissensions among the Whigs and also giving training to his own friends whom he could trust. Having accomplished this, by 1770, he appointed Lord North as his Prime Minister, and the latter occupied that position up to 1782, 12 years. It was during this period that a dispute between English colonies in North America took a serious turn, and the War of American Independence started. England was defeated, and she had to recognize the independence of the American colonies by the Treaty of Versailles of 1783. In December 1783, Pete the Younger was appointed Prime Minister, and he held the office up to 1806 with some breaks. Now, when the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Pete the Younger was at the helm of all affairs in England. The Industrial Revolution and Agricultural Revolution were making a lot of progress in England, and as a result, England was leading Europe in the field of agriculture and industrial production, or precisely in the economic sector. With this, we come to the end of Britain till 1789. Look into the rise of Prussia. Now, as regards to Prussia, its prestige had been raised very high during the reign of Frederick the Great, who ruled from 1740 to 1786. Now, it was he who annexed Silesia, and in spite of the efforts of Maria Theresa of Austria during the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, to get back the same, Frederick was able to retain it notwithstanding heavy odds against him. Although Catherine II, the Great of Russia, means there was a Catherine I who was the wife of Peter I, Peter the Great. His wife's name was also Catherine. She is not considered to be Catherine the Great because she ruled hardly for 2 years. Catherine II was wife of Peter III. After her husband's death, she assumed the throne and ruled for almost 34 years. And her rule was glorious indeed. Now, although Catherine II, or Catherine the Great of Russia, wanted to annex the whole of Poland herself, Frederick persuaded Austria to join hands with him to force Russia to give them a part of spoils. Now, as I said, rivalries and alliance. Look at the second point of this slide, that Maria Theresa was at that time the Austrian queen, or rather if you want to call her a regent, whatever, but she was the authority of Austria at that time. Frederick took Silesia from Maria Theresa. She wanted to regain that again under her control, but she couldn't because of Frederick's deep opposition. Despite he was facing various kinds of odd situations, he maintained his stand. Therefore, there was a sort of rivalry between Germany and Austria at that time. But again, see, when Russia was intruding into the European affairs so and so that when Catherine's intention was to annex the whole of Poland, Frederick persuaded Austria to join hands. Now, there again, the rivalries, though were there, still it was not so great. The results was that when Frederick persuaded Austria to join hands with him to force Russia to give them a part of the spoils, the result of this was that when the first partition of Poland took place in 1772, Frederick was able to get West Prussia as a part of his share. With the help of West Prussia, Frederick was able to link up East Prussia with the rest of his territories and thereby established the territorial continuity of Prussia. It is only after 100 years, if we see, that the total unification of Germany was taking place, and it was Prussia who was actually leading the campaigns against France, against Denmark, against Austria itself, 1861, 66, 71, and this way. And finally, in 1871, we can see the ultimate unification of Germany ended. Now, if we see this 1772, is also an important mark because Frederick got West Prussia, and 1700 and 1871, almost a century later, the unification of Germany took place under the leadership of Prussia and one of the successors of Frederick himself. Frederick also prevented Austria from acquiring Bavaria. Look at this. At one time there is rivalry, at one time there is alliance, again at one time there is rivalry. Frederick also prevented Austria from acquiring Bavaria by exchanging it with Austrian Netherlands or Belgium. He also formed the Fürstenband, or the League of German Princes, with a view to putting a check on the power of Austria in Germany. As regards his home policy, he promoted the material resources of the country. He improved agriculture by draining marshes. He constructed new canals. He encouraged industries by giving subsidies. He worked day and night. He worked very hard to bring about the material prosperity of his country and his folks. He followed a policy of religious toleration and was prepared to allow even the Turks to come to Prussia if they could add to the prosperity of his country. Now, when Frederick died at the age of 74, quite a ripe age, right? That is, in 1786 he was aging 74. He left behind a kingdom which was nearly double in size, with a population more than doubled. He considered himself as the first servant of the state. Now, however, he always thought more of Prussia and not of Germany. Though he did not rule the entire Europe, but he was one of the most celebrated rulers of his time. Now, after the death of Frederick the Great in 1786, Frederick William II came to the throne. Now, he was a man of feeble intellect and vacillating nature. He was opposed to both Austria and Russia. When the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Prussia was interested more in the affairs of Poland than those of France. Let us see what was Russia doing at that time. As it is seen before in the previous slides, that Catherine, we always come across the name of Catherine the Great of Russia whenever we are talking about the European situation during the time of the French Revolution. Because Catherine the Great ruled from 1762 to 1796, a whole lot of 34 years. Almost 3.5 decade long rule did Catherine ushered on Russia. Now, she was an enlightened despot. She took pleasure in the company of the learned persons of Europe and patronized literary persons like Diderot. She was also able to set up a very efficient system of administration as well. The Black Sea was open to Russian navigation. The independence of Crimea was recognized. Russia was to have a consuls in Turkey. Russian subjects were to be allowed to visit the holy places in Palestine. Russia was given the right to interfere in the internal affairs of Turkey to protect the Greek Christian subjects of Turkey. Can you imagine the power and influence Russia enjoyed during that time in Europe, that she was permitted even to interfere in the internal affairs of some countries? This is unimaginable importance Russia got at that time. Now, she did not have to fight to get that, though she did in the previous times, but now during this time she was already an established power. Now, as I said, that she can actually interfere in the internal affairs of Turkey to protect Greek Christian subjects of Turkey. It means that though peacefully this was made into effect, that you can interfere, you have the right to protect your Greek Christians, but peace between Turkey and Russia did not last long, and war was renewed in 1787. That is, there was a war before, which actually came to the settlement with Russian right to interfere in Turkish policies, or rather in Turkish internal affairs. Again, when this interference increased and when the Turks Turkic administration realized that the interference is unavoidable, or rather is unjustifiable, the conflict between Russia and Turkey renewed in 1787. That means the situations were not at all peaceful at that time. Now, during this time, Catherine joined hands with Joseph II of Austria to dismember Turkey. Austria was forced to withdraw from the war in 1791 on account of triple alliance between England, Prussia and Holland. However, Russia carried on the war alone, which was ended in 1792 by the Treaty of Chassey. Now, what is this treaty? By this treaty, Turkey recognized the Russian annexation of Crimea. Catherine the Great played the most important part in the three partitions of Poland in 1772, 1793 and 1795. We came across the partition of Poland in 1772 while viewing the Prussian context when Frederick the Great was in power. Now, her original idea was to annex the whole of Poland, but both Prussia and Austria joined hands to force her to give them a part of the spoils in 1772. As regards to the partition of 1793, Austria got no share, but Prussia got something. In the third partition of Poland in 1795, Russia got the lion's share, although both Prussia and Austria got some of their share. It cannot be denied that Catherine the Great raised the prestige of Russia in Europe. Now look at this. 1772, when Prussia forced Russia to give some of the parts, it was Frederick the Great was ruling. Now, when in 1793 and in 1795, in both the cases, Frederick William II was ruling. That means his feeble nature is quite visible from these things. Now let us go to Spain, or let's see how Spain was doing at that time. Now, Spain was a great country during the 16th century under Charles V and Philip II. She became a second-rate power during the course of 17th century. Reactionary forces directed the destiny of the country. After the War of Spanish Succession, the grandson of Louis XIV of France was recognized the ruler of Spain. In 1761, Spain entered the 7 Years' War on the side of France. Now, Spain, if we see that the grandson of Louis XIV was recognized as the ruler of Spain, that means the Bourbon dynasty was ruling Spain at that time. Even today, the current monarch, Philip VI, belonged to the same dynasty. A series of reforms were carried out by ministers like Albemarle and Patino during this time of the then ruler Charles III. Now, further reforms were carried out by which the legal system was reformed and the economy of that country also progressed. An impetus was given to the intellectual life of the country also. The new king, Charles IV, was weak and an unsteady person. So in this way we come to the end of France as well. The last country, Austria-Hungary. The Habsburg ruled in Austria-Hungary at that time, and their emperor was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. However, this state was not very strong because the territories were scattered and there were people of many nationalities within the empire. There was no solidarity on the account of their racial, religious and linguistic differences. The bond of union between the Bohemians, Hungarians, Netherlanders, Milanese and Austrians was a very weak one. Maria Theresa was the ruler of Austria from 1740 to 1780. She was a woman of lofty character and high spirits. She was an able ruler and a vigorous reformer. It is true that she lost Silesia to Prussia, but she left no stone unturned to recover the same, and she had her share of the partitioning of Poland. Now look at this. All the stable and good rulers actually helped both their countries. That means Frederick the Great of Prussia and Maria Theresa of Austria helped, or rather convinced, Catherine was forced to give shares to them of the partition or the spoils of the partition of Poland. Now when she died in 1780, Joseph II, who became the Holy Roman Emperor, succeeded her in 1765, but after his father died. That is, in 1765 it was his father who died as a Holy Roman Emperor, and Joseph II succeeded him, and he inherited the dominions of the House of Austria in 1780 on the death of his mother, that is Maria Theresa. He was a typical enlightened despot. He was industrious and conscientious. He worked day and night for the improvement of the people. His object was to unite all the dominions of the House of Austria by abolishing all differences of race, language, and religion. He aimed at welding together the various races of his empire into one Austrian nation. He abolished the old territorial divisions and redivided the whole empire into 13 provinces. Each province was put under a military commander. Provinces were divided into districts and towns, and a uniform system of government was set up in all of them. However, his reforms were carried out in hurry, unmindful of the sentiments and traditions of the people. The people were not ready for these reforms. Joseph II boasted that he had made philosophy the architect of his empire, but by doing so, he committed a blunder. He ought to have known that philosophical ideas rarely find a place in practical life of the people, and that too when people were ignoble at that time. Ignoble, the right word to choose for them at that time. The Austrian Empire was in a state of intense ferment on the eve of French Revolution. She was not only interested in the affairs of France, but was also concerned over the intrigues of Russia and Prussia in Poland. This divided attention was in the interest of the cause of the French Revolution. Thus, we come to the end of the topic, that is Europe on the eve of French Revolution. We learnt about the condition of Europe, the economic condition of Europe at that time, the condition of the society of Europe at that time, and politics at that time. Thus, we come to the end of this video and the entire topic with the end of today's slide presentation. Thank you. Hope you will find this interesting.